Somewhere in the court records of Northeast Tennessee, there is a document that describes a family as free persons of color. The family called themselves Portuguese. Their neighbors called them something else entirely. And for 200 years, everyone agreed to leave it alone. Then the DNA kits arrived. The hollows of the southern Appalachians are not an easy place to disappear. The ridges run steep and parallel, and the valleys between them are narrow enough that a settlement in one cove could go a generation without meaningful contact with the settlement in the next. The terrain was not simply difficult to travel, it was difficult to administer. Census takers came rarely. Tax rolls missed entire communities. Court jurisdiction over the deep mountain counties was inconsistent, sometimes delayed by years. The mountains created gaps in the official record, and certain communities learned to live inside those gaps. One of those communities had settled into the ridge country where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina converge. They were farming people. They owned land, passed surnames down through generations, worshipped in Baptist and Methodist congregations, and by the early 1800s were known across several counties. And yet they occupied a position in the social and legal landscape of the region that no one could quite resolve. They were not classified as white. They were not classified as enslaved. They owned property that the law theoretically reserved for people in categories they did not fit. They existed, documented and visible, in a space the law had not designed for them. The word their neighbors used for them is one that researchers have argued about for decades. Its origins remain disputed. Some linguists trace it to a Portuguese term for a mixed ancestry person. Others have proposed Creek or Cherokee roots. A few historians believe it was simply a corruption of something overheard and misrecorded by a county official who had no better category available. What is clear is that the community itself used the word reluctantly, when they used it at all. What they preferred to be called shifted, depending on who was asking, and what the consequences of the wrong answer might be. That word was Melungeon. To understand why a community would spend 2 centuries carefully managing how they were identified, you have to understand what the law was actually doing to people during this period. Virginia's racial classification statutes, first codified in the late 17th century and expanded repeatedly through the 18th and 19th, did not simply record social reality. They manufactured enforceable legal consequences out of ancestry. The threshold shifted across different decades and jurisdictions. In some configurations, one documented African great-grandparent was enough to alter a person's legal classification entirely. And that classification was not a social inconvenience. It determined whether you could vote, whether you could testify in court against a white man, whether a contract you signed was legally enforceable, whether your children could attend school, whether your marriage existed in the eyes of the state. In some periods, in some counties, it determined whether you could hold the land your family had farmed for 3 generations without someone having the legal standing to take it from you. The law did not ask who you were. It was not interested in who you were. It asked what you were. And what you were had a precise, enforceable answer that the state was prepared to supply if you did not supply one yourself. Given those stakes, the question is not why these communities constructed alternative origin stories. The question is how they chose which story to tell. Portuguese was not an arbitrary selection. Under Virginia legal precedent, persons claiming Portuguese descent occupied a genuinely ambiguous position, European adjacent in ways that certain rulings, at certain moments, had found sufficient to avoid the hardest classifications. Turkish ancestry carried similar ambiguity. Native American ancestry, depending on the county and the decade, sometimes offered a degree of legal insulation, particularly before federal removal policies consolidated authority over tribal classification. The families who told these stories were not confused about their origins. They were operating under a system that made the truth of their origins dangerous, and they selected the cover story that had the best documented chance of working in the jurisdiction where they happened to be living at that moment. These were legal calculations made under pressure, refined across generations, and passed down not as mythology, but as operational instruction. This is what you say. This is who we are when someone asks. The genetic evidence entered this story in the late 1990s and early 2000s through peer-reviewed research in genetic genealogy. Studies examining the core Melungeon family lines, the Gibsons, the Collinses, the Goins, the Miners, among others, applied Y chromosome analysis to trace paternal lineages and mitochondrial DNA to trace maternal ones. The pattern that emerged across the core families was consistent. Paternal lineages showed predominantly sub-Saharan African origins. Maternal lineages showed predominantly European ancestry. Native American ancestry appeared at later stages of the genetic record, consistent with intermarriage after the founding community had already formed, not with the ancestral origin stories the families had carried. Portuguese ancestry, as a documented genetic or genealogical reality for the core family lines, did not appear. The cover stories had been constructed to survive court scrutiny and hostile record-keeping. They were not built to survive Y chromosome haplogroup analysis. The cost of maintaining a constructed identity across generations is not only legal or social, it is something more personal than that. Many Melungeon descent families moved westward continuously, tracking the American frontier, because the frontier, by definition, was a place where no one knew your grandfather. Each relocation was a renegotiation, a new county, a new congregation, a new set of neighbors who had no reason to ask what a Virginia Mountain County court had written about your family decades earlier. Researchers documented a saying that circulated among these communities: "You turned white when you moved west." The phrase captures something precise about what was happening. Whiteness, in this context, was not a genetic condition. It was a distance measurement. Put enough miles between yourself and the last person who remembered, and the classification could be renegotiated. What was passed down in these families was not always the truth about their origins. What was passed down was the habit of managing the question, the instinct, refined over 200 years, to hold the story steady when someone began to probe. Some of those families are still holding it. The consumer DNA kits changed the calculation in a specific way, not because they revealed something the families could not have suspected, but because they produced a form of evidence that could not be managed the way the old stories could. A letter from a family patriarch affirming Portuguese heritage can be passed down until it becomes indistinguishable from documented fact. A genetic ancestry report delivered to a mobile phone does not respond to family tradition. It does not negotiate with what has been said at the kitchen table for 150 years. The story that sustained a family through generations of legal pressure does not have a haplogroup. The DNA does. What the DNA restored was not a clean identity. The ancestry is too layered and too old to resolve into anything simple. What it restored was a more precise account of what the law had cost, which families it had fractured, which stories it had made necessary, and what those stories buried in the process of protecting the thing they were built to protect. The court document in Northeast Tennessee still exists. The family name is in the record. The classification is written there in the clerk's handwriting exactly as it was set down in a county that no longer enforces the law that required it to be written that way. What the document cannot tell you is whether the people it described ever stopped knowing who they actually were. Whether 200 years of saying the same thing is sufficient to make it true. That question the DNA cannot answer either.